Young Millionaire thought she was just a babysitter. But she ended up stealing his heart. "You're here to babysit, not redecorate my life," Nick Caldwell said sharply, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Olivia as she rearranged the papers scattered across the kitchen counter. Olivia froze, a blush creeping up her cheeks. She hadn't meant to touch his things, but the chaos in his pristine penthouse made her hands itch. "I was just trying to make some space for the groceries," she said quietly, lifting her chin to meet his gaze. Nick leaned against the marble island, his tailored suit fitting him like a glove, exuding power and wealth with every inch of his presence. At only 32, he was a self-made millionaire, known for his sharp business acumen and even sharper tongue. But right now, all Olivia could think about was how rude he was. "Groceries." He echoed, his tone dripping with disbelief. "This isn't a suburban kitchen, I have a chef for that." "Well, your chef didn't restock the fridge," Olivia shot back, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. She was here to watch over his 6-year-old daughter, Emma, not to get barked at by a man who clearly thought his money made him untouchable. Nick's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a small voice interrupted them. "Daddy, can Olivia stay for dinner?" Emma peeked around the corner, her wide brown eyes hopeful. Nick's expression softened instantly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he crouched to his daughter's level. "We'll see, sweetheart," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Olivia watched the transformation with a mix of surprise and admiration. For all his arrogance, Nick clearly adored his daughter. It was the only reason Olivia had agreed to take this job in the first place. Emma deserved someone who cared, and Olivia needed the money to pay off her student loans. Still, she hadn't expected her new boss to be so intimidating or infuriatingly handsome. "I'm fine eating at home," Olivia said, her voice more composed now. "Thank you, though." Nick straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he didn't quite believe her. "Suit yourself," he said coolly, before turning back to Emma with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As the evening wore on, Olivia found herself drawn into Emma's world of tea parties and make-believe castles. By the time Nick returned from his study, she was seated on the floor with a tiara on her head, laughing as Emma insisted on being the queen. Nick paused in the doorway, his gaze lingering on the scene. There was something disarming about the way Olivia fit so effortlessly into his daughter's life. He shook the thought away. She was just the babysitter, nothing more. But as the weeks passed, Nick found it harder to ignore Olivia's presence. She wasn't like the other nannies he'd hired, women who treated Emma like a chore or saw him as an opportunity. Olivia was different. She was kind, patient, and maddeningly determined to speak her mind. One evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Nick found Olivia in the kitchen, humming softly as she washed the dishes. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice softer than usual. Olivia glanced over her shoulder, a small smile playing on her lips. "I know, but it's better than sitting around doing nothing." Nick hesitated, then stepped closer. For the first time, he noticed how tired she looked, the faint circles under her eyes betraying long hours and little rest. "How long have you been working like this?" he asked. "Like what?" She asked lightly, though there was an edge to her tone. "Non-stop, babysitting during the day, cleaning up my mess at night." Olivia set the dish in the rack and turned to face him. "I don't mind hard work, Mr. Caldwell. It's what pays the bills," he frowned. "Call me Nick." Her brow arched, but she nodded. "All right, Nick, anything else?" He wanted to say something, anything, but the vulnerability in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he simply shook his head and walked away, leaving Olivia to wonder if she'd imagined the flicker of warmth in his expression. Neither of them realized it yet, but something had shifted between them. And it was only the beginning. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the penthouse earlier than usual. Emma had a school field trip, and Olivia had promised to help her pack. She stepped inside, her breath catching for a moment as she took in the sprawling view of the city from the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows. No matter how many times she came here, it never stopped feeling surreal. She was halfway through helping Emma zip up her bright pink backpack when Nick emerged from his bedroom, his tie hanging loose around his neck and his phone pressed to his ear. He was mid-argument, his voice sharp and commanding, but when his eyes landed on Olivia and Emma, his tone softened slightly. "I'll call you back," he muttered, hanging up. "Good morning, Daddy," Emma chirped, running over to him and throwing her arms around his legs. Nick crouched to hug her, his expression softening in a way that still surprised Olivia every time she saw it. "Morning, Princess. Ready for your big day?" "Yes." Olivia helped me pack. "She even let me bring my favorite tiara." Emma beamed, holding up the sparkly plastic crown that Olivia had tucked into the side pocket of the bag. Nick glanced at Olivia, his lips twitching in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "That was nice of her," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Olivia shrugged, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's no big deal. Every queen needs her tiara, right?" Emma giggled, and Nick's gaze lingered on Olivia for a moment longer than necessary before he stood. "I'll drive her to school today," he said, surprising both of them. "You?" Olivia asked before she could stop herself. Nick raised an eyebrow. "Is that so hard to believe?" "Well, yes," Olivia admitted, earning a laugh from Emma and a mock glare from Nick. "Watch it," he said, though there was a hint of amusement in his voice. 15 minutes later, they were out the door, leaving Olivia alone in the penthouse for the first time. She wasn't sure what to do with herself. Her schedule revolved around Emma, and without her, the place felt strangely empty. She decided to tidy up the living room, folding the throw blankets and straightening the cushions. She was halfway through organizing the books on the coffee table when her phone buzzed. It was a message from her landlord, a reminder that rent was due next week. Olivia sighed, her chest tightening. She'd been stretching every dollar since taking this job, but it still felt like she was barely staying afloat. She couldn't keep living like this forever. When Nick returned later that afternoon, Olivia was in the kitchen, prepping Emma's snack for when she got home. She glanced up as he walked in, loosening his tie and pouring himself a glass of water. "How was the field trip drop-off?" she asked lightly. "Chaotic," he said, leaning against the counter. "Parents everywhere, kids screaming. I don't know how you deal with it every day." Olivia laughed softly. "You get used to it." Nick studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're good at this," he said finally. "At what?" "Taking care of Emma, keeping everything together." Olivia felt a flush creep up her neck. "It's just part of the job." "No," Nick said, his voice firm. "It's more than that. Emma's happier since you started." "I've noticed." Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Emma burst through the door, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Olivia, Daddy, guess what? We saw a real dolphin on the field trip." The moment was broken, and Olivia turned her attention to Emma, listening intently as the little girl recounted every detail of her day. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Olivia gathered her things and prepared to leave. As she slipped on her coat, Nick appeared in the foyer, his hands in his pockets. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yeah," Olivia said, adjusting her scarf. "I'll see you tomorrow." Nick hesitated, then said, "Wait." Olivia paused, glancing back at him. "What is it?" He looked almost uncertain, an expression she wasn't used to seeing on him. "Have dinner with me," he said suddenly. Olivia blinked. "What? Dinner?" Nick repeated. "You're always rushing out of here. Stay, I'll have something delivered." The offer took her by surprise, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said carefully. "Why not?" Nick asked, stepping closer. "Because—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. It's not professional. Nick's jaw tightened. You've spent months taking care of my daughter, Olivia. I think we're past formalities. The way he said her name soft, almost pleading, made something in her chest tighten. She looked away, shaking her head. I should go, Nick sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, but just so you know, professionalism isn't the only reason you're saying no. Olivia froze, her hand on the doorknob. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're scared, Nick said bluntly. Scared of what this might turn into. She turned to face him, her eyes flashing. You don't know anything about me. I know more than you think, Nick said, his voice calm but firm. And I know you feel it too. For a moment they stood there in tense silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Finally, Olivia shook her head and opened the door. Good night, Nick, she said quietly, stepping out into the hallway before he could say another word. But as the door closed behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. And that terrified her more than anything. Olivia shoved her hands deeper into her coat pockets as she walked briskly down the dimly lit street toward the subway station. The city's chill had seeped into her bones, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was Nick's words, his voice echoing in her head. You feel it too. She shook her head as if the motion could fling the thought away. No, she couldn't let herself get swept up in him. Nick Caldwell was a world she didn't belong to. Wealth, power, impossibly good looks, it was all too much. She was just a babysitter, a struggling woman with a mountain of bills and no time for foolish fantasies. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. Olivia focused on Emma, avoiding Nick when possible and keeping their conversations short and professional when it wasn't. He didn't push, but she could feel his eyes on her sometimes, like he was waiting for her to say something, anything. She didn't. It wasn't until Friday evening that everything unraveled. Olivia was tying Emma's sneakers by the front door when Nick walked in, his presence commanding as usual. But this time, he was dressed in a sleek black tuxedo, the sharp angles of his jaw more pronounced under the low light of the entryway. Wow, Daddy, you look like a prince, Emma exclaimed, clapping her hands. Nick chuckled, kneeling to kiss the top of her head. Thanks, Princess. I'm going to a gala tonight. He straightened, his eyes flicking to Olivia. You should come. Her hand froze mid-knot. Excuse me. You heard me, he said smoothly, as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world. Olivia stood, crossing her arms. Nick, I'm not exactly gala material. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. And what exactly is gala material? You know, designer dresses, expensive jewelry, the ability to walk in heels without falling on my face, she said dryly. None of which are problems, Nick said, pulling his phone from his pocket. I'll have a dress sent up within the hour, shoes too. Olivia blinked, stunned. You can't be serious. I'm always serious, he replied, his mouth curving into a small, confident smile. You've been working yourself to the bone. You deserve a night out. This isn't a night out. This is your world, she argued, her voice rising. I don't belong there, Nick. Emma looked between them, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. Olivia, you should go. Daddy never takes anyone to those fancy things. Olivia sighed, rubbing her temple. Emma, sweetie, I don't think Emma's right, Nick interrupted, his tone firm. You'll be fine, trust me. Her stomach twisted at the weight of his gaze. Trust me. The way he said it made her want to believe him, but logic screamed at her to say no. I don't have time for this, she muttered, turning back to Emma. Okay, kiddo, let's go brush your teeth before bed. Nick's voice stopped her in her tracks. If you don't say yes, I'll have no choice but to bring a date who'll bore me to death talking about stocks and mergers all night. Olivia spun around, glaring. That's not my problem. Maybe not, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a low rumble. But I'd rather spend the night with someone who challenges me, Her breath hitched, her heart pounding against her ribs. She hated how easily he could disarm her. "You're impossible," she muttered. "And you're going," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. An hour later, Olivia stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest bathroom, staring at her reflection. The dress Nick had sent up, a midnight blue, floor-length gown with a plunging neckline and intricate beading, fit her perfectly, hugging her curves in ways that were both flattering and terrifying. The matching heels were surprisingly comfortable, and the stylist he'd insisted on sending had worked magic with her hair, pinning it into an elegant updo. When she finally emerged, Nick was waiting in the living room, adjusting the cufflinks on his sleeves. He looked up at the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, and for the first time since she'd met him, Olivia saw him falter, his sharp, confident demeanor softened as his eyes swept over her. "You look stunning," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Olivia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You don't look so bad yourself," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. Nick stepped closer, offering his arm. "Shall we?" She hesitated, then looped her arm through his, her pulse racing as they descended to the waiting car. The ride to the gala was silent, the tension between them palpable. Olivia kept her eyes on the city lights flashing past the window, trying to ignore the way her arm felt against his, the warmth of his presence so close. When they arrived, Olivia's nerves hit full force. The venue, a grand ballroom dripping in crystal chandeliers and gold accents, was packed with people who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. She felt completely out of place. Nick must have sensed her discomfort because he leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "Relax," he murmured. "You're with me." His words didn't calm her, but his hand on the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd did. He introduced her to colleagues and business associates, his arm brushing hers every so often, sending tiny sparks up her spine. To her surprise, he didn't treat her like an accessory or an afterthought. He included her in conversations, even steering topics toward things she could contribute to. As the night went on, Olivia found herself laughing at his dry wit and clever comebacks, forgetting for a moment that this wasn't her world, that she wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't until they were alone on the balcony, the city lights stretching out before them, that reality came crashing back. "You're full of surprises, Olivia," Nick said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. She turned to him, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," he said, gesturing between them. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," Olivia laughed nervously. "That's because I'm not from this world, Nick. I'm just a babysitter." "You're not just anything," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You're smart, kind, stubborn as hell, and you've turned my life upside down." She opened her mouth to respond, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was no trace of the arrogant businessman she'd met months ago, just a man who looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. "You scare me, Olivia," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because for the first time in a long time, I don't know what I'm doing. I just know that I don't want to lose you." Her heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice. "Nick." But before she could say anything else, he closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was as gentle as it was consuming. And for the first time, Olivia let herself stop fighting her feelings and kissed him back. Nick stood in the doorway to the penthouse's expansive living room, the city's glittering skyline behind him, waiting. Olivia hadn't said much since they left the gala, but she hadn't let go of his hand either. Her silence wasn't cold, it was thoughtful, like she was sorting through a tangle of emotions she wasn't ready to share yet. He didn't push her. For all his business world bravado, he knew when to stay quiet. Tonight had been a leap for both of them. For the first time in years, Nick had let his guard down, Let someone see the man behind the tailored suits and ruthless reputation. And it terrified him how much he wanted her to stay. "Some tea?" Olivia asked suddenly, breaking the silence as she walked toward the kitchen. She slipped her heels off along the way, the elegant gown still trailing behind her. She looked out of place in his stark, modern penthouse, but at the same time she didn't. She fit too well. "Tea," Nick repeated, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I was thinking more along the lines of wine." Olivia glanced at him over her shoulder, her lips quirking up. "Wine at 2 in the morning." "Bold choice, Caldwell." He loosened his tie and stepped into the kitchen, watching as she opened a cabinet in search of mugs. "You're calling me Caldwell again." "That's not a good sign." "I'm trying to remind myself who you are," she said, her tone light but her words loaded. Nick leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "And who am I, Olivia?" She paused, her hand hovering over the sugar jar. When she looked at him, there was no teasing in her eyes, just raw honesty. "You're my boss. You're a millionaire." She stopped, shaking her head. "You're someone I shouldn't be falling for." Nick pushed off the counter, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. "But you are," he said softly, his voice steady, unwavering. She didn't deny it. Instead, she looked down, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the marble countertop. "Nick, us. It doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to," he said, tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "I don't care about what makes sense." "I care about you." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the vulnerability in her eyes was almost too much for him to bear. "This isn't my world," she whispered. "I'm not some polished socialite who knows which fork to use or how to talk about hedge funds at dinner parties." Nick let out a low chuckle. "Olivia, I don't need a socialite. I need someone who makes me feel alive, someone who makes me laugh, someone who challenges me." He cupped her face, his thumbs brushing against her cheeks. "I need you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "I don't want to be another woman who just passes through your life." "You're not," he said firmly. "You never were." The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and real. Olivia searched his face, looking for any trace of doubt, but there was none, only sincerity, only Nick. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Me too," he said, a small, self-deprecating smile tugging at his lips. "But I'm more scared of letting you go." For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then, slowly, Olivia leaned into his touch, her hands resting lightly on his chest. "I don't know how this works," she said softly. "We'll figure it out," Nick promised. "Together." Her lips curved into a tentative smile, and when she nodded, it felt like the weight of the world had lifted from both their shoulders. Nick pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. The following week, Nick was waiting for Olivia in the lobby of her apartment building. He had insisted on picking her up for dinner, despite her protests that she could take the subway. She hadn't seen him much since that night. He'd been traveling for work, but he'd called every day, his voice a steady reassurance that he wasn't going anywhere. When she stepped out of the elevator, dressed in a simple yet stunning black dress, Nick's breath caught in his throat. He'd arranged for a driver, but at that moment, all he wanted to do was stand there and take her in. "You clean up nicely," she teased, gesturing to his tailored suit. Nick grinned, offering her his arm. "You're one to talk." They arrived at an exclusive rooftop restaurant overlooking the city, the kind of place Olivia had only seen in movies. The maitre d' greeted Nick by name, leading them to a private table surrounded by flickering candlelight and soft music. "This is a lot," Olivia said as they sat down, her eyes wide as she took in the view. Nick reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You deserve a lot." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died on her lips when she saw the look in his eyes. Instead, she squeezed his hand, a soft smile spreading across her face. "Thank you." Dinner was effortless, filled with laughter and stories, the kind of night that felt like it had been plucked from a dream. Nick watched her as she talked, captivated by the way her eyes lit up when she was passionate about something. He knew he was in trouble, but he didn't care. He was all in. As dessert arrived, a decadent chocolate soufflé that Olivia insisted was unnecessary. But amazing, Nick reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. "Olivia," he began, his voice steady but his heart racing. "I know this might seem fast, but when you know, you know." Her eyes widened as he opened the box, revealing a delicate diamond bracelet. "Nick, this is not what you think," he said quickly, chuckling at her stunned expression. "It's not an engagement ring." "Not yet, anyway." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her cheeks flushing. "You scared me for a second." Nick smiled, fastening the bracelet around her wrist. "This is just my way of showing you how serious I am about us, about you." Olivia stared at the bracelet, her fingers tracing the diamonds. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But you didn't have to, I wanted to," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment, she just looked at him, her heart full to bursting. "You're impossible," she said finally, shaking her head. "And you love it," he countered, his grin widening. She laughed, leaning across the table to kiss him. "Maybe I do." As the night stretched on, the city lights twinkling around them, Olivia realized something she hadn't been ready to admit before. She belonged here not because of the wealth or the glamour, but because of him. Because with Nick, she felt seen, valued, and loved in a way she never had before. And as he held her hand, promising her the world, she knew she'd finally found her place.